Who are you trying to impress, and at what cost? I try to use thought-provoking questions sometimes, and I realize that if I don't give you enough time, you're not really thinking deeply about it. So let me just ask you again, and I realize this is something you could probably think about for, an entire day. Who are you trying to impress? Why? And at what cost? In the early 18th century, Maria Gunning discovered the cost of trying to impress just a little too much. Maria Gunning was considered one of the most beautiful women in all of Europe. And, this is pre-social media, where she would have been, one of the most followed Instagram influencers or social media influencers. This is where actors and actresses made all the money. So, you had to actually see them in person. And so Maria had people constantly flocking to her anytime she was out in public. And so she actually had a military escort every time she went out, and she went out every day for her daily walk in Hyde Park, London. And she had a military escort with her because the crowds would just flock around her to see this absolutely stunning woman. But her influence, her ability to impress people with her beauty came at a price. Remember, 18th century, so we're talking about the early 1700s, makeup was not like it is today. You go to the store today, you can go to Walmart and get a high quality makeup. I have no idea, I'm just assuming. But in the early 18th century, makeup was actually lead-based. Yeah, they didn't know. So they just mixed lead into it. And then because lead is acidic and not supposed to be on your face, it actually caused blisters and all kinds of her body was reacting. So then she put on more makeup to cover up, and eventually she died at 27 years old of lead poisoning. She's not the only one. The queen at that time, Queen Elizabeth I, also died of lead poisoning as a direct result of putting on makeup. Well, fortunately for all of you ladies who like wearing makeup, the quality improved and the cost went down. So that when you got to the late 18th century, women were using beeswax to cover up the imperfections and little bumps and pockets on their faces. And that was a big deal because smallpox had been a really serious problem. It caused a lot of deaths. And so people that survived, you have a lot of people that survived. And so women would have these pockets all over their face. They would use the beeswax to cover it up, and then they would powder over that. As a result, sometimes you didn't get it quite right. And so one woman would be talking with another woman and notice the lumps or bumps of the beeswax. And the woman might respond by saying, "Hey, mind your own beeswax." So whether you knew it or not, that's actually where that phrase came from. Mind your own beeswax. And the beeswax would harden. And so if a woman smiled, she would actually crack a smile, which is where that phrase came from. And then if you sat a little too close to the fire, like a fireplace, and you're having a kind of a social in your house, and you kind of end up near the fire, and it would begin to melt, and the woman would be losing face. So the phrase lose face comes from literally the beeswax melting. And so another woman might say to her, "Hey, mind your beeswax." Isn't that great? So all these little phrases and idioms that we've developed over time. I don't know the last time I ever heard somebody say mind your own beeswax, like I did maybe like in third grade, but like back for me when I was back in the late 18th century. But here's the deal. Who are you trying to impress? Why? And at what cost? It cost Maria her life. Maybe it's costing you your health, your emotional well-being. Because who we try to impress reveals what we fear. Right? If we're trying to impress our friends, and maybe how you flex or flirt or dress to impress, what you post and what you don't post, what you Photoshop or the filters that you use, right, reveals not just who you're trying to impress and why, but what you fear. And I think for most of us, like, let's be honest, right? Like, I could do an entire message just on fear, and every single one of us could relate to that. But rarely do we ever dig under the surface to ask, why do I fear? And what you will discover is that your fears often are directly related to who you're trying to impress and why. So the person who's working way too many hours, bringing their work home and giving way too much to impress a boss because what they're afraid of is losing their worth that they find in their net worth. Maybe they find their value in their identity in their position or a promotion. So what they fear is losing that status. Maybe you're trying to impress your friends because what you fear is rejection or betrayal at a deep heart level. I want to introduce you to two kings, two different kings, each who struggled with trying to impress, to please people. The first two kings of the nation of Israel, and this story is found in the Old Testament of the Bible. So if you're not really familiar with the Bible, you have the Old Testament, which is a story, the story of how God interacted with people and the entire nation of Israel before Jesus. And then you have the New Testament, which is the times of Jesus and the church. So when you get to, you have a couple different historical books. One of them is 1 Samuel. And in 1 Samuel, you have this moment where the first king, Saul, is challenged and told to obey God with a very specific instruction, except he ignores it. So he's confronted by the prophet Samuel, and in this, you have a revealing moment where Saul explains why. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 24, Samuel has confronted him, and now Saul is responding. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. The word sinned in this context means to miss the mark, which can be taken one of two ways: aiming for the right target and falling short, or aiming for the wrong target and hitting it. Meaning I missed the mark because I should have aimed there and I aimed there. And Saul is saying, I fell short of the right target and I aimed at the wrong target and I hit it. I missed the mark and I sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men. You see it? Think about it. A king over an entire nation. And you know what he's afraid of? What people think of him. He's afraid of the men, the soldiers that he was supposed to be leading. And he goes, so I gave into them. The actual translation there, so if you don't know, the Old Testament of the Bible is predominantly written in Hebrew. There's a few chapters that are written in Aramaic. But in Hebrew, that word, the word that they translated, I gave into them, is more like I obeyed them. So he goes, I was afraid of them, therefore I obeyed them. You know what you discover? The people you try to impress will reveal who you fear or what you fear and who you obey. You'll do what they say, whether you want to or not. Samuel says, as a result of your disobedience, God's going to remove you as the king of the nation of Israel. In essence, you're about to lose everything. And you want to hear what Saul's response was to discovering that he's going to lose everything? Saul replied, I have sinned. Hey, I admit I missed the mark. But please, I beg you, honor me before the elders of my people. In essence, help me save face. I don't want to lose face. I know my beeswax is dripping. Help me save face in front of the people of importance and before all of Israel. Come back with me, in essence, put on a show so that I may worship the Lord your God. He goes, not my God. Would you come back with me? I want to put on a show and I want to impress people so that they think God is with me, even though he's obviously not. Who you try who you're trying to impress, reveals who you're trying to please, reveals what you fear, and whom you will obey. Now let's switch over and we'll find the second king, David. So who did he lose his kingdom to? David. And interestingly, David has a little struggle with this situation. Now I have to give you a little context because we're flipping pages. We're gonna go to another historical book called First Chronicles. The background of it is before Saul took over, became king, the nation had been in battle, and God was making it clear that they were disobeying him, and so he was withdrawing his blessing. Well, one of the statements of his blessing was this sacred box they had. It was called the Ark of the Covenant, or the Ark of God. Now, if you've ever seen Indiana Jones, there's this one, I think the first one is Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Am I the only one that's seen that? Really? Thank you. Really? Seriously? Hey, just quick teaser. Watch list starts next week, right? Like, Indiana Jones, we might get an appearance at some point or another. But in that, like you have this, like they're searching for the lost Ark of the Covenant, and then they find it, and I won't, if you haven't seen it, whatever. But it was a box overladen with gold that God had commanded Moses to have made, and the box was representative of God's presence. God was dwelling in, God put a little bit of his presence in that box, which is a little weird for us, but it's important because there was very specific instructions with how that ark was supposed to be handled. Well, they went into battle and they were defeated. The ark was taken by the enemies, the Philistines. And there was some trouble because they now had this ark and they didn't know what to do with it. And all of a sudden, all kinds of trouble started happening in their cities. Wherever the ark was, there was trouble. So they wanted to get rid of it, but they weren't quite sure. They were a little superstitious. So they came up with a plan. They thought, okay, we're not quite sure that the reason why we're having all these problems, like tumors, we're breaking out all the people. So what they did was they put the ark on a cart and they put 2 cows that had just calved as the ones to haul the cart. And what they figured would happen is this: if this wasn't like the result of God's punishment, then these cows would stay with their calves. But if the troubles they were having were divine punishment, then these cows would ignore the lowing of their calves and would go straight back to Israel and bring the ark with them, right? Well, that's exactly what happened. And they went straight to the closest city, Kiriath Jearim. When they got there, the people found the ark in this cart and they carefully took it off and then just put it into a house. But nobody else cared. Saul didn't care. David becomes king and he cares. He says, I want the ark of God's presence in the city of Jerusalem. And so this is where the story picks up in 1 Chronicles chapter 13. So it reads this way: he then said to the whole assembly, and you're going to kind of hear a little bit of hints of where this is going. He then said to the whole assembly of Israel, if it seems good to you, and if it is the will of the Lord our God, let us bring the ark of our God back to us, for we did not inquire of it during the reign of Saul. The whole assembly agreed to this because it seemed right to all the people. So you kind of get a little hint that maybe the way they're approaching this might not be the right way. In fact, they don't. The way they handle the ark is they put it on a cart hauled by 2 oxen. What does that sound like? They're borrowing the way they handle God from the world around them, from their pagan neighbors, their pagan enemies. What they were supposed to do was the ark was always meant to be carried by the Levites. It was a box and there was little ringlets on it, and they were supposed to put golden poles through, basically there was rods overladen with gold. They were supposed to stick it through the ringlets, and then they were supposed to be carried by the Levites on their shoulders. And it was never supposed to be touched. Okay, pay attention to that, that's important. When they came to the threshing floor, so David leads the nation, there's this huge singing, there's big festivals. It's like a giant religious party. When they came to the threshing floor of Kidon, Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark because the oxen stumbled, and the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah and struck him down because he had put his hand on the ark, and so he died there before God. What? Patrick, what are you doing? reading from 1 Chronicles chapter 13 in 2023. I mean, God's not like that. What kind of God is this? This is crazy stuff. People just drop dead because they touch a box. Some of you are a little creeped out. Some of you are like, this is why I've steered clear of church. This is why, I think Christianity is a little weird, because there's people who read stories like this. And I gotta be honest with you, me too. I'm a little creeped out by this. Good. Maybe there's some things that you read about God that will make you uncomfortable. If everything you believe about God makes you comfortable, you don't believe in God. You believe in the God of your own creation. God created us, and then we created God in our image. I don't think I quite said that exactly how I meant it, but you get the point, right? God created us in his image, so we return the favor, and we created God in our image. Here's the deal. If everything you think about God is comfortable for you and safe for you, you probably don't know God. Because this issue, what's relevant in 2023 is this. What David did, a little bit like Saul. Saul wanted to impress people, he wanted to please people, so he feared people and he obeyed people. David had a similar struggle in this moment. He listened a little bit too much to the crowd, and so he began to use God to get what he wanted. God is not a God to be trifled with. God is not a toy or a pawn or a lucky charm that is just used to get what we want. He's God, sovereign over the universe. When he speaks, the universe comes into existence. And even a box that has a little bit of his presence in it, that is representative of his sacred, holy being, must be treated with honor and reverence. And that's really the point. What I want to quickly get to is this. You want to learn from this lesson in 2023? It's this. We must learn to live in awe of God. Awe of God. He's not just a little box. Hey, what's up, God? What? He's not just my buddy, my teddy bear. Hey, what's up, big guy in the sky? Here's the deal. What went wrong with Saul, and where did David go wrong? Saul sinned. He disregarded the command of God and did what he wanted because he was trying to impress. He was more afraid of the people than he was of God. And as a result, it cost him his own life, and it cost him the nation. David disregarded the plan and the ways of God, did what was pleasing to the people, put on a show and appearance that God was present, and it cost him somebody's life. You and I struggle with the same sin instinct that disregards God and we do what we want. We wrestle with trying to please people because truly we're afraid of people. At the deepest part of who you are, you fear what people think. You want to be liked. You want to impress people. You and I spend way too much time thinking about what others will think of us. You know what's crazy about that? They're all thinking about what people think of them. Truth is, most people aren't thinking about me or you. They're thinking about themselves, but we're trying to impress people because we want to please people. And as a result, we're obeying people. We're obeying what the culture tells us. We're obeying what the community of our workplace is pushing us into, what the classroom is pushing on us. So you want to know what the answer in this moment in history? You want to know how we can get this right? Live in awe of God. Jump ahead. Fast forward through the history of the nation of Israel. You get to the time of Jesus, Jesus' death, his resurrection, his ascension, and the beginning of the early church. You get to one of the authors who wrote a book to one of those churches, a letter to one of the early churches. It's called the letter to the Hebrew church, the Jewish church. And the author in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 28, 29 writes it this way. Let us be thankful. God, thank you. Thankful, and so worship God acceptably, the kind of worship that God is willing to receive, which means there's an unacceptable kind of worship. The kind of worship that Uzzah and David were offering when they disregarded God's commands and thought they could worship God their way, when they were trying to use God for what they wanted. Saul saying, please just come and put on a show so I can save face. Let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire, which means there's something about the way we come to God, that I must come to him as though God is a consuming fire. Here is the story. You and I, because of sin, we should be consumed. And we will be consumed. As hard as that is to say, hey, look, today's the day I'm saying some hard things. Because of sin in our heart, we're separated from God and we're headed toward an eternity of unending fire. But don't worry, that's not how the story ends. There's a really good, crazy twist. And that is that God stepped from heaven to earth, entered into our sin, our shame, our guilt. Yeah, you can celebrate that. He stepped into our world, our messiness, and God got really close to us. In fact, you could say that God touched us. The holy and perfect touched the imperfect and the judged and condemned. And it cost him his life. He was struck dead for us. Did you see the switch? Some of you should be like, your jaw should be dropping. You're like, Jesus became the Uzzah. He took it on himself. The fall that we deserve, Jesus took on. He died in our place. He embraced the punishment of our sin. He embraced our shame and guilt. What should have separated us from God caused Jesus to be separated from the Heavenly Father. In his death, we died. He embraced our eternal judgment so that anyone who believes in Jesus by faith is forgiven. But unlike Uzzah, Jesus rose from the dead, triumphant over the very sin that separates us from God, so that in his resurrection we're reunited with God through faith in Jesus, because Jesus not only rose from the dead, but he rose triumphant over eternal fire, so that when we believe in Jesus by faith, you and I can enter into relationship with God. In essence, you can come into the presence of a consuming fire and not be burned up. Some of you should be thinking about something like Moses and the burning bush. You can get close to a God who is a consuming fire. Hey, so let me just pause for a moment. If right now you don't have relationship with God, maybe you've never said yes to Jesus by faith, can I give you a moment to just believe in him? You don't have to impress anybody else. You can be free from the fear of trying to impress and please people. And the only thing you do is you believe in Jesus by faith, receive new life through him. So take a moment, put your faith in Jesus. And if you're saying yes to Jesus, would you let us know? Put a QR code up on the screen that you can scan. And when you scan it, fill out that form so one of our pastors here in Hagerstown, Pastor Spencer, will follow up with you online. We have one of our pastors will follow up with you to encourage you as you begin this new journey in relationship with God. And we want to help you. We want to teach you how to live in relationship with God, because hopefully you get a sense from even what I'm speaking about, that there's more to this relationship than just an initial believing. There's a journey. In fact, you kind of have to work on it. You see what I did there? We have to work on this thing. Like, we don't start out getting the concept of how to live in awe of God. And so let me jump back into the story, because you know what's cool? David blew it royally, and yet that's not how the story ends. If you jump back to 1 Chronicles chapter 14, there's this moment where David gets it right. And it says that he learned to obey. He obeyed the voice and command of God. And this is the very next verse. So David's fame, he became famous. His fame spread throughout every land, a little hyperbolic, but across the region. And the Lord made all the nations fear him. Do you notice? When David got this whole awe of God thing right, others reverenced and respected him. Who you try to impress will drive who you fear and how other people treat you. When you learn to serve an audience of one, when you learn to live in the awe of God, others will respect you. Because if you live your life just to impress people, people pick up on that. They pick up on those insecurities, and they can even respect you less. David learned to obey God, and as a result, he gained influence, and others respected and honored him. So what's the key here? There's a couple lessons I want you to take away. There's two complementary ideas of what it means to live in awe of God. The word awe is actually made up of two words, at least in the biblical languages, which is Hebrew and Greek. So if you go to the Hebrew, which is what this is originally was written in, the word awe is actually two ideas. The first is this. It's the word fear. So that means you and I should live in the fear of God. Now notice the way I wrote that. I was very intentional. Live in the fear of God. I could have written live in fear of God. Now that's what David did, right? When he made the mistake, after Uzzah dies, it says this in verse 12. David was afraid of God that day and asked, how can anyone ever bring the ark of God to me? What happened was, because David didn't have a proper awe of God, a proper respect and reverence, he had to live afraid of God. That's fearing God. Meaning he grew in terror of God because he didn't properly come to God. And when you don't properly come to God with reverence, then you live afraid of God and you distance yourself from God. See, the fear of God will bring you close to God. Fearing God pushes you away from him. And it's all about a heart reverence. When I'm interacting with my boys and trying to teach them certain things, I want to teach them to be properly afraid of the right things, right? A proper fear of an axe. There's a right way and a wrong way to handle it. Chasing your brother around the yard is not the right way. There is a right way to stand when you swing an axe. There's a right way to push the mower. When you're pushing the mower, you should be afraid of what's going on underneath the casing, right? Because if you get your foot a little too close, you might be missing some toes. There's a proper fear of the mower. And so we come to God the same way. And when we don't, be much afraid. Right? If you didn't pick up on it, I got a bunch of kids, like 6 of them, I think. And I mean, not very often. I mean, almost never. But rarely, one of them doesn't show the respect they probably should. Hopefully you can tell I'm being a little bit ridiculous here. Just slightly exaggerated. I would say almost every single day, many times a day, I get one of them that's mouthing off or being a little disrespectful to me. And as a result, I feel the need to remind them who's in charge. And so I bring them to their mother. No, right? Like every once in a while, as parents, you kind of have this moment when you're like, I think I need to put the fear of God in you. Right? So when we come to God, there's this moment we have to come to God in the fear of God, which is just simply a heart posture of reverence and awe. God is awesome. With a word, he speaks the universe into existence. With a word, he can speak the stars into motion. With a word. He became the word. Let's recognize in the fear of God what it's like when God speaks, when he speaks through his word, when he speaks a word into your heart. God, I'm going to come to you in reverence and awe, for you're a consuming fire. There is, in the Westminster Abbey, there is a bust of John Marr, who was a missionary and a leader in the West Indies, and he was also known as Lord Lawrence. And under the bust of his head, there is a statement that says, he feared man so little because he feared God so much. Here's what I know about the fear of God. When you fear God, you don't have to fear anything else. When you live to impress God, you don't care about impressing anybody else. Fearing God means I want to please God. I just want to make God happy. I want God to look at my life and say, well done, good and faithful servant. You're going to discover something powerfully freeing when you shift your focus from worrying about what anyone else thinks to simply saying, God, what do you think? When you begin to align your life with the word of God and you know that God is pleased with you, what pleases God? A life of faith. Now, let me give you one more step. Because when you get remember I said two complementary words. Fear, this is about the awe of God. How do you live in the awe of God? Fear, the appropriate fear of God, and fascination. They go together. Fear, fascination. Isn't that true? Like when you think about the idea of awe, something that is awesome, something that is worthy of awe is something that is both frightening and fascinating. Think Grand Canyon. Think being in the middle of the ocean alone. Fear, fascination. On the top of a mountain with 8 miles to get out at sunset. Fear, fascination. Listen to David. This is the story of how they got it right. 2 Samuel chapter 6. So King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom. Meaning he was scared, so he had them put the ark down and they left it right where it was. And it happened to be at the house of Obed-Edom. Well, here's what happens. Everything Obed-Edom had was blessed because of the ark of God. Now David gets jealous. Wait, I want God's blessing, and I don't just want God's blessing, I want God's presence. So what does he do? He begins to prepare. 1 Chronicles chapter 13 says it this way, 15. After David had constructed buildings for himself in the city of David, he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, no one but the Levites may carry the ark of God. See, he got it right. Because the Lord has chosen them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister before him forever. David assembled all Israel in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord to the place where he had prepared. Interestingly, you want to hear a little quick footnote thought? You know, it says, up to the place, bring up the ark of the Lord. Jerusalem is actually down. Like if you look directionally, Jerusalem is actually below where Obed-Edom lived. So why are they going up? Because in Hebrew, everything goes up to the house of God. So they use the word up always when they talk about Jerusalem. And so the idea of you always ascend, it's a reverence. Everything in your life should be looking up toward God. And so then it goes like this. It concludes with this simple thing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and fattened calf. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all of his might. And while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. Right? So we live in the fascination of God. That's the invitation. When you learn to live in the fear of God, then you can live in the fascination of God. What's the fascination of God? It's worship. What was David doing here? As they were bringing in the ark of the presence of God, there was this righteous worship. Their heart was in the right place. And because of that, David could dance. David could celebrate. Man, there's actually freedom in God's presence when you come to him in reverence. Because you know what you stop doing? You stop worrying about what anybody else thinks. Who cares what anybody else thinks? Man, if I need to raise my hands, I'm going to raise my hands. If I need to bow my knees, then I bow my knees because I don't really care about what you think. I'm physically presenting myself humbled before the Lord. And I don't care if you think whether I'm humble or not. God, I want to please you. If I need to lay flat before the Lord, if I need to give, if I need to surrender, I can be fascinated in the presence of God. And so I want to land this with a little exercise. We're going to put a graphic, an image, a picture up on the screen. It's a famous painting of Jesus in the boat during the storm. And if you know the story, the storm hits and Jesus is asleep in the boat. The disciples are afraid of the storm and they say to Jesus, they wake up and say, don't you care if we drown? They're more afraid of the storm than they are of God. Here's God in the boat and they're worried about the storm. Jesus speaks and the storm stills and suddenly the storm shifts from outside the boat in their hearts. They become afraid. Who is this Jesus that can speak calm to a storm? That's what needs to happen in our lives. The fear shifts from what's around us to a proper fear of God in us. Why? Because the ark of God, when you believe in Jesus, isn't some sacred box outside. It's inside of you. Do you treat your own heart as the ark of God's presence? So what I want you to do is I want you to look at this picture. Where are you in the boat? Where do you see yourself? What does God want to speak to you about that? And as he's speaking to you, let me take a moment, just read some verses. Maybe about what you can do about that. David wrote in Psalm 25, "Who are those who fear the Lord? He will show them the path they should choose. He'll guide them. They will live in prosperity and their children will inherit the land. The Lord is a friend to those who fear him." David also wrote Psalm 34, verse 7. "The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them." Psalm 85, verse 9. "Surely his salvation is near those who fear him." And another verse, "He fulfills the desires of those who fear him. He hears their cry and saves them." David's son Solomon wrote Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." Jump ahead to the time of the early church. In Acts chapter 9, verse 31, it says this, "Then the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace. It was strengthened and encouraged by the Holy Spirit. It grew in numbers, living in the fear of the Lord." What does God want to speak to you about? Who and what you fear? Who and what you're trying to impress? Who and who you're obeying? Would you allow me to pray over you? Heavenly Father, thank you for sending your son Jesus, who touched the unholy, the sinful, who touched death and took our fall, so that through faith in Jesus, we could be forgiven and given new and forever life. Give us heart postures of fear and fascination of you, that we would want to come into your presence, jealous of your blessings and your goodness, captivated by the enormity of your compassions, awed by the vastness of your holiness. We come to you, learning to live in awe. In Jesus'